So, good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar covering cybersecurity and fraud prevention for law firms. My name is Lucy Quick, and I'm the Digital Marketing Manager here at InfoTrack. And I'm delighted to be joined by Tom Lyes, Director of Engagement at Lawyer Checker. Good morning to you, Tom.
Good morning, Lucy.
Tom will be sharing his top tips on cybersecurity prevention and updates around the current fraud landscape, so staff are aware of those telltale signs to look out for. Before we begin the webinar, I would like to draw your attention to the Q&A tab, which is located at the bottom of your screen. We will be running a Q&A at the end of this session, so please type any questions you might have for Tom, along with your name, into the Q&A box. That way, if we run out of time or your question requires further explanation, we can extract your information and follow up with you directly after this webinar. I will now hand over to Tom. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy, and thank you for having me on. Really looking forward to today. So what I'm going to do is really talk about some of the key things that you can do as a business and also as individuals within a law firm to mitigate the risk of fraud and cybercrime. So we're going to look at some of the no-brainers that you should look to implement if you haven't already. We're going to spend some time talking about education, because people are such an important defense when it comes to fraud and cybercrime. We'll talk a little bit about password security and the guidance around this. We'll talk about the dark web and try and help you to understand the sort of criminal journey as to how they will infiltrate networks and sort of get into a law firm's ecosystem. We'll also spend some time talking about the importance of testing. So yes, it's really good to have the layers of protection and some of these things implemented, but how do we test that and how do we make sure we're really robust? Before we do that, I just wanted to share a bit of a sort of landscape in terms of the current sort of fraud and cyber position. So we've done some recent analysis on SRA scam alerts. If you don't know what a scam alert is, there's a section on the SRA website which effectively allows law firms to report any fraudulent attempts to impersonate them to the regulator. And these can be email, this can be website, this can be telephone impersonation, can be all sorts of different types of fraud. And between March 2020 and March this year, we've seen 113% rise in those SRA scam alerts. 89% of all the 2020 alerts impersonated real firms. So there was a strong sense there that fraudsters still focus heavily on the impersonation side. Fraudulent websites are still really relevant. These sort of died off a little bit, but have come back in the last 12 months. There was a well-known example in March this year of a fake firm created called Lake Solicitors, which appeared on the SRA scam alerts. And in December last year, there was a real splurge in law firms having their own websites copied and impersonated. And email modification fraud remains a major threat. So 55% of all the alerts related to fraudulent email activity. This will still be a criminal's most common way to infiltrate. However, we've also seen, having spoken to some insurers, a rise in criminals, especially conveyancing wise, reverting to phone call methods of impersonation, in particular when it comes to diverting the customer's deposit funds, which I'm sure many of you will have seen sort of email attacks in relation to that. A couple of really interesting things also came out of the thematic review that the SRA carried out last year on cybersecurity. So they sampled 40 firms who had been targeted by cybercrime in the last 3 years. Out of those 40 firms, there was 4 million stolen from 23 of those firms. There was also a significant correlation between the firms that had been visited and whether they had Cyber Essentials Plus and the benefits to that business. So I think the SRA released a quote which basically said the firms that had Cyber Essentials Plus were in better position to defend themselves, because ultimately it's not a case of if you get targeted, it is unfortunately a case of when you get targeted. If you haven't read the SRA Thematic Review on cyber, and that's an area of that interests you, I'd certainly encourage you to read it. I think there's some really good content that came out of that. So now I wanted to just move on to sort of some of the things you can implement either as individuals or as a collective business that will help you create layers of protection against fraud and cyber attacks. So in terms of the no-brainers, we are seeing a big shift in law firms and their attitude towards Cyber Essentials Plus and Cyber Essentials. Lawyer Checker as a business or an IASME approved Cyber Essentials Assessment Centre, and we do that specifically for the legal sector. We've seen a big shift in firms moving towards the Cyber Essentials Plus accreditation over the last year because of some of the benefits of the testing and the remote audit carried out there. And we'll talk a little bit more about Cyber Essentials Plus as we go on there this morning. But I think training is really a key one to start with here. So people. It's absolutely critical that staff at all levels of the business receive the appropriate training in terms of being able to understand the telltale signs of a phishing email, and also in terms of being able to report that correctly and to the right structure. There's two ways of looking at your people. They're either your strongest asset or they're your weakest asset. And wherever they sit on that graph, you really need to be working towards getting them to be your strongest asset. How you do that, especially in a remote working environment, and given how busy the general conveyancing market has been, is a challenge. There's no doubt about that. And there isn't any one size fits all approach as to how you should train your people. And you may have a training department in your law firm who takes care of this. You may not, and you may look to seek outside help, which is absolutely fine. There's lots of really good people in this space. I would recommend looking at the National Cyber Security Centre. So later in the presentation, I'll provide a link to one of the free training tools they have, which is about a 30-minute training process. Obviously, coming from the National Cyber Security Centre, we're talking very much best practice and expertise here. I think that's a really valuable resource. And I think the other thing to mention around training is about trying to keep it engaging and to keep people interested, especially when you might not see them in terms of them not being in the office. Keeping people engaged with training is a really key to getting that to work. Remote working has obviously had an impact on cybercrime. So the Hiscox cyber readiness report, which came out recently for 2021, shows that cybercrime rose for the first time since 2018. And obviously home working has got a significant part to play with that. If you've got staff working from home, you really need to invest in a VPN, which is a virtual private network. If you haven't got one of those, speak to your IT people about that, because it's certainly something that will create a barrier of protection around your infrastructure. The other thing that's a really useful thing to stop criminals, especially impersonating email and getting into the law firm's ecosystem, is two-factor authentication on your emails. So if you use Microsoft 365, then that two-factor authentication can fairly easily be switched on. Two-factor authentication just means that when you log into your email for the first time, or after logging out, you log back in, you will get a text message with a code to your mobile number. I think two-factor authentication is an absolute no-brainer for law firms to try and reduce the chances of a criminal getting into that email infrastructure and then trying to obviously communicate to clients around things like deposit funds or beneficiaries and things like that. And if you don't use 365, there are still ways of doing that. Again, it's a case of speaking to your IT people to work out how you can sort of improve that. I had a question in terms of training. In terms of keeping training engaged, what can we do? So I would say think about successful training that you've done in the past. An angle of competition is always good. So make it competitive, i.e. you might have some sort of quiz, and you might have someone externally come in to deliver that if you feel that it needs a fresh voice. Those are two examples of things that you can do to keep it engaging. You might also want to break people off into smaller groups and do it in small chunks. Sometimes if you do training sessions in large groups, some people will sit back and not engage, whereas if you do it in more smaller groups, you'll get more buy-in and more participation from people. In terms of the absolute no-nos, so the first one came up in the SRA Thematic review. So do not allow external data sticks to be freely used and plugged into machines. Effectively, what you really need to be doing is blocking people's USB ports. This is an easy way for criminals to infiltrate any business, and on numerous testing in the legal sector, this has been found to be a considerable weakness. One of the things that we see a lot as a Cyber Essentials Assessment Centre is people who come to us in the early stages of that to discuss it with us will often talk to us about the fact that they're worried that they're using operating systems that have run past their support life and have no security updates. That's a really key one to try and protect yourself against. So make sure all your operating systems are in their support life and have security update functionality, because by not blocking off that, that's effectively a pretty much an open door for cyber criminals. We're going to focus specifically on password security, and I'll talk more about this journey around using the same passwords for personal and work, but that really is a no-no. And I know it's difficult. We all have lots of passwords in this day and age, but to try and use different passwords for personal and work is key. National Cyber Security Centre recommends something called 3 distinct words, and it's called longer and stronger, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Solely relying on outsourced IT people also carries risk. As a leadership, so as either a partner or a board of directors, it's really important for me that cyber sits on your board agenda every month or every quarter. It's not acceptable to rely solely on outsourced people here. You really need to test it. You need to understand the risks and what they are, and you need to make sure you're happy with how the firm's overall strategy towards this looks. One of the reasons that, and this is something that we've seen over the last 2 years since we became a Cyber Essentials Assessment Centre, there's quite a lot of outsourced businesses and will look after different sectors. So they might not understand the specific risks and challenges within your sector. They might also work in education or the public sector or things like that. So really key to take ownership of that and to ask and challenge where that's concerned, I think is valuable. And we'll talk about some of the ways that you might look to do that in a minute. So I said we'd talk specifically about passwords. So the graph on the right-hand side was taken from the thematic review, where it was shown that of the 40 firms that were visited, very few staff had actually read the NCSC, which is National Cybersecurity Centre's password guidance, and only about half of managers and leaders had. The 3 random words technique to help create less predictable passwords is your best method of defense in this area. So those of you with good memory might recall that a few years ago, password guidance was very much change your password every 28, 30 days. That has changed and evolved because what people were doing was ultimately adding numbers either at the start. So they put 1, 2, 3 at the start. Yes, we've all done that at some point. They might add 1, 2, 3 at the end. So it's becoming really easy for criminals to sort of crack passwords. We talked about 2-factor authentication. That will help significantly with that. And in terms of emphasizing the risks of reusing passwords across home and personal accounts, if we have a look at the way a criminal would normally harvest their data, so criminal will normally start by buying data in the dark web, and that data may simply be an email address and a password. It might be an old password, or it might be the current password. It doesn't then take a great deal for that criminal to search using that information, find out where that individual works. Let's say the breach is from a well-known source in terms of personal breach. That criminal can then find out where the individual works, probably by LinkedIn or other forms of social media, and they can begin their potential attack. So that is the reason why it's important for people not to use the same passwords at home as they do at work. It's the journey that the criminal will go to find out where that person works. It's not hugely difficult, especially like if you're someone like me with a quite unusual surname. It's not very difficult to work out where I work. And attackers will exploit well-known coping strategies. So if we go back to those statistics that we looked at the start around SRA scam alerts, why are they significantly higher? Why have they risen? Well, ultimately, conveyancing remains a criminal's perfect choice in terms of a law firm because of the busyness of the market and the number of financial transactions. It's natural that over the last year or so that has been the most targeted area. It's not to say they don't target other areas of law. We've seen more attacks in private client, especially around beneficiaries, etc. But ultimately conveyancing and that journey of money from either client to law firm, so the criminal trying to impersonate the law firm to get that person to pay their deposit funds, or vice versa, has been a real challenge. Obviously, at Lawyer Checker, we are most well known for providing protection in relation to funds transfers, in that we're used on 1 in 4 residential conveyancing transactions when law firms send money to another law firm, and we still see instances of that monthly where cases are blocked and prevented. But I think that real journey of money from either the client to the law firm or the law firm to the client, are either proceeds of house sale, is something that needs some certain thinking. Had a question to say, is it dangerous to display the email addresses for lawyers on a website? I wouldn't say it's dangerous. There are obviously some significant benefits to doing that from a communication perspective. There is obviously the risk attached to that, but ultimately the criminal probably would find that out anyway, in terms of being able to work out the domain and the format of the domain. So you could do that, but that's by no means a foolproof method. It's potentially still quite easy for the criminal to gain an email address. And you might think that actually by not doing that, some of the benefits of not doing that cancel it out. So that's why you see many people still keep their email addresses on. Okay, so the dark web I mentioned very briefly in the last slide around the criminal journey. So the dark web is a part of the internet that isn't indexed by search engines. It's used for criminal activity. You've probably seen it referenced in lots of Netflix dramas that you might have watched. And it's a hotbed of criminal activity. What you can do though is there are some really useful tools out there where you can monitor whether your email domain is available for sale on the dark web. So there's two websites, and one of them is called Scurio, and the other is called Have I Been Pwned? On Have I Been Pwned, if you just Google that phrase there, and if you do that now, and then just type in either your work email address or your personal email address. What you'll be able to see, hopefully, when you put that in, is how many times that email address has been used in a data breach and whether it's for sale on the dark web. It will often tell you a little bit of history about how those details got there. So a lot of the brands you actually see in that are quite well-known brands. Fitness apps tend to be quite a common one. And what we would say is ideally someone should be monitoring this for you, whether that be IT or risk. There are tools out there that you can monitor this on, so you can stay ahead, hopefully, of email modification attacks by doing this sort of thing. It's a really useful tool. Have I Been Pwned is free. Scurio, there is a paid service on there where you can pay for a certain number of domains. But that journey which the criminal goes through will often start with the dark web. So if you haven't seen this before, it's definitely worth spending a little bit of time looking at that. A common question that we get is, how can we stop a criminal impersonating our email address? And you've probably seen different types of this attack. So you'll have seen the type where the criminal uses an email address which is really similar. So maybe replaces an O with a 0, or adds a second letter, or removes a second letter, or something like that. You'll have seen the really obvious, where it comes from like a horrible Gmail account or something like that. And then you'll have also seen the really convincing, which is whereby the criminal can impersonate the exact email address of the law firm. The impersonation of the exact email address is much simpler to do than many people understand. There's a 10-minute video on YouTube which actually shows you how to do this. It's not that difficult. You don't need high degrees of IT competency. There are ways you can still protect against a criminal doing that. So you can have something called DMARC, which is an email security setting set up correctly. There is, unfortunately, a vast knowledge gap in IT about how to actually implement DMARC. And it's not easy to do, but there are tools out there to help make that happen. But it's a bit of a no-brainer to protect your domain. And if we think everything in relation to the cyber criminal again, if we look at that journey, anything you can do that makes it more difficult for the criminal when they're looking from the outside in will help, because they'll often just move on to an easier target. Other things you can do is avoid using words like bank details in emails. This is really key from a conveyancing point of view. So criminals who are sat in a client's email or even your own network will often run scripts, and the scripts they run will look for words like bank account, bank details, etc. Avoid having conversations of that kind on email. And I think this goes back to something I spoke about a moment ago in terms of the journey of money. So think carefully about how you communicate to your clients about how they pay their deposit fees. And I think it's absolutely critical that that is first port of call and last port of call is done verbally. And you communicate that verbally to clients, or if you've got secure portals or secure messaging services, use them. Don't do it via email, and don't just solely rely on your engagement letters, and speak to the client and say, these are the details, get them to write it down and note it, and really make that foolproof. Also, there are other things you might want to do in terms of this, like the two-factor authentication that we've already spoken about. But hopefully that gives you some tips as to how you can protect the domain. And the last thing to mention is, don't necessarily buy a load of domains. If you own a number of email domains and you don't use them, ask yourself, what are you doing with the ones that you don't use? Because there's an argument to say by owning those, you're sort of owning the liability of them to a degree. And actually, you don't necessarily want to own that. There's been a lot of talk over the last few years about best practice where that's concerned. And I think it's certainly gone to a place now where the advice is, don't own more domains than you actually need or have to own. So I mentioned I'd share a couple of useful links with you. These will be available in the slides that we share after. And I just wanted to speak about a couple of them. So first of all, we've got exercise in a box. So at the very start, I said we'd talk about testing. It's all well and good having great people, layers of protection, but if you don't test them and you don't understand how you would deal with an attack if it happens, you put yourself in a precarious position for when that attack actually happens. So exercise in a box, which sounds something like Joe Wicks might have come up with in lockdown, is an online tool from the National Cybersecurity Centre, which helps organisations test and practice their response to a cyber attack by ultimately giving you certain scenarios which you can act out, and you can carry out sort of test attacks. I think it's a really valuable tool, especially if you're a larger firm and you've got a strong IT department. This is something that they really should be taking advantage of. If you're a smaller business, then the National Cybersecurity Centre released 10 steps to cybersecurity last week. It's specific SME guidance targeted at small to medium businesses. And included in that is a focus on cyber essentials. Last week at the Cyber UK 2021 conference, the IASME, the overall certification body for cyber essentials, released a new cyber essentials readiness tool, which is a really good tool for firms who are considering this. So at Lawyer Checker, we obviously support law firms with the assessment of this. And we talked to our first 2 clients, I say clients, prospective clients, through this at the end of last week. So we have a cybersecurity expert who will be able to talk through the questionnaire and help you fill that in. And that will give you an idea as to whether you're ready for assessment. And if you're not ready for an assessment, it will give you the areas which you need to go away and make some tweaks to. And I emphasize the word tweaks, and it's very rarely we're talking about infrastructure upheaval here. So the other way of testing is obviously, and these are just what the images of what the Cyber Essentials Readiness Tool and exercise in a box look like. So you can see that. But the easiest way to test, and for you as a law firm leader or as a manager of a department to satisfy your overall cyber position, is to go through Cyber Essentials Plus certification. Now, it's obviously recommended by National Cybersecurity Centre, also recommended by the SRA and the CLC in their cybersecurity toolkit as well. And the reason why this is so valuable is having an independent audit of your effectively cybersecurity will give you a real good understanding of where you are and what to work on. And the principle of Cyber Essentials Plus is very much in line with other things you'll do in the firm. So you'll obviously audit your accounts department, and you will also audit your conveyancing files regularly. This is effectively just replicating that. At Lawyer Checker, we can help you with this. We've assessed over 150 law firms since we started doing this in January 2019. We'll help you with the preparation if you're unsure of where to start. I think that's a real key part of how we sort of help firms during this process. And then what really happens is with Cyber Essentials Plus, you complete the basic version of Cyber Essentials online, and you will do that through a portal. We will mark that for you. And if there's anything you need to change to pass, we'll talk you through what that actually is and give you guidance. Once you've passed your basic, we'll book you in for a remote audit. So a remote Cyber Essentials Plus audit will carry out an internal and external vulnerability scan. And we'll also take a sample size of devices. So especially people who are working from home, that's really important. Cyber Essentials Plus is now factored in home working following some recent changes about 3 weeks ago. And then we will help you ultimately get to a position where you pass, which might be straight after the assessment, or you might need to do some remedial work, which again, we'll advise you on what that is and what you exactly need to do. If you want more information about Cyber Essentials or Cyber Essentials Plus, then more than happy to share that with you. You just need to contact me either on my email address or my mobile number. The cost of accreditation is the basic version is £300. The plus version is £1,495, and they're annual accreditations, but you will gain significant knowledge from going through the plus process. Having spoke to people who've done that over the last 6 months to a year, you'll feel much more comfortable about your overall cyber position. We have a couple more questions, I think. Okay, this is a good one. What do you think about the payee confirmation service now offered by most banks? Okay, so confirmation of payee it came into play the early part of last year. So it's been around for about a year now. And I think it's a useful layer of protection. The weakness of confirmation of payee is that not all UK banks are signed up to it. And you need both banks to be signed up for it to work. So although it's a bit of a last gasp sort of area of protection, that's what it's meant to do. It's meant to be the final barrier. One of the challenges, obviously, is with not all banks being involved. So from an overall risk management perspective, things like Lawyer Checker or our consumer bank account checker, still really important you do them because you'll be doing them earlier rather than at the last minute. Because one of the questions is, what happens if confirmation of payee flags something? Well, you're right at the stage of money transfer. Ideally, you'd want to pick things up before that. And if you look at law firm to law firm, our Lawyer Checker best practice is order that early through InfoTrack, and then you do the refresh search, which is available. So yeah, I think it's a useful layer of protection, but I don't think it's a hugely robust standalone layer of protection, and it would be nice to see more banks sign up to it over the next year or so. And then the cost of cyber certification process, I think I just covered, which is £300 plus VAT for the basic version, and then £14.95 for the plus version. And more than happy to talk any questions anybody's got about that through with them and help them with the Cyber Essentials readiness tool. That brings me pretty much to the end of the presentation. Hopefully what we've gone through today is practical advice that you can go away and implement in your firm without significant upheaval, and also some things for you to ultimately think about, which might be more strategic and might be more medium to long term. If you ever have any sort of cyber questions that you want to fire at me, my contact details are on the slide. If I don't know the answer, I can certainly always point you in the direction of someone who will know the answer. So thank you very much for everyone for joining us. I think we've covered all the questions, haven't we, Lucy?
Thank you, Tom. We have actually just had a couple more come through.
Oh, okay.
Perfect. So the first one is, where should firms start in relation to getting a Cyber Essentials certification?
Okay, so where you should ultimately start is here. So the Cyber Essentials Readiness tool. So they released IASME released this last week. So this will effectively tell you what you need to do to become accredited, or if you are ready to become accredited. We've started talking people through this over the last week or so, and the early feedback has been a really valuable addition to the Cyber Essentials process. And then we can obviously help you towards assessment. The value in working with the businesses like Lawyer Checker for this is that we're completely independent. So we look at things with a fresh pair of eyes. We're not connected to your IT in any way, because there is a theory that if you use your IT provider for this, they're effectively marking their own homework. So looking at it with a fresh pair of eyes is really valuable.
Thank you. What protection should firms be considering for mitigating the risk of working from home?
Okay, so I think if you look at working from home, I think the key thing is VPNs. So making sure that connection between business data and that individual are solid and robust. The two-factor authentication is another one that firms really should consider. Cyber Essentials Plus as well, given the new information around working from home, is also something that they ought to think about and should probably be implemented. And also to make sure, and this is sort of covered in Cyber Essentials, but to make sure you have a bring your own devices policy. And you've also got mobile device management. If you've got people using mobile devices that are accessing business data, etc., those are the type of things that you need to be considering.
Thank you. What details should we be going into on PII renewal forms about cyber?
Okay, so this is a really common question that has cropped up over the last sort of 12 to 18 months. We're seeing more insurers ask more detailed cyber questions, and I think that will continue with the proposed changes around what is covered in PI insurance that both regulators have a consultation on at the moment. So I think this is very much a case of being able to sell your story. So to talk about the defense layers that you've got in place, and to talk about improvements that you've made is really key. I think insurers will be looking to see that firms have moved with the situation of the last year or so in terms of layers of protection. So I really think you need to closely look at that whole cyber piece and really try and tell that story to the insurer as to what you've done, what you've implemented, and also what you are going to do, because they're also quite interested in what you're going to do as well. So I think it's really about sharing that story, but going into as much detail as possible on those initial cover letters. Yeah, it might not make a difference immediately, especially as in the hard market that we're working in, but it may well stand you in good stead and going forwards. But I expect that we will start to see more and more questions about cyber defences as time goes on.
Thank you, Tom. What do you know about the SRA consultation on PII and cyber cover?
Okay, so this is reasonably recent, and the CLC have also started a consultation. And this is really about clarifying what the PI insurance covers from a cyber perspective, as there is ultimately a bit of a grey area there at the moment, or there has been a grey area, and the insurers have been, Lloyd's of London have said basically this is something that needs to be clarified and cleared up. So it's about sort of confirming who covers what in terms of losses. There is a bit of debate around separate cyber insurance. So it doesn't seem like the regulators are going to mandate that firms have separate cyber cover. There's an argument to say that if you've got a well-known and good insurer, they will make sure that you have separate cyber cover, because the reasons for having separate cyber cover are slightly different. So one of the benefits that comes with cyber cover, for example, is incident reporting, and if you are attacked, you've then obviously got a response team that will be able to act for you if that happens. That's the reason why a lot of people choose separate cyber cover, and also the costs are vastly different. So the cost of separate cyber cover is absolutely minimal when you compare that to the cost of professional indemnity insurance. So I'd encourage you to engage with the consultations. It will help you understanding of what's covered there, but the purpose of it is really to clear up a grey area. But no, keep your eyes peeled on that, because I think they're hoping to have the changes in place by October if they can.
Thank you. We've just got a couple more questions that have come through. Have there been any recent high-profile fraud cases you know about? Okay,
so there has been one in the last month that is relatively high profile. There was an exclusive in the newspaper. The easiest way to probably find that is just Google my name and the newspaper, because I commented on it, which is a really in-depth fraud case which uses ID fraud. So this is seller impersonation fraud effectively. It also involves funds transfer fraud. So it involves the the money being sent to a fraudulent law firm or someone impersonating a law firm. And I think it really just goes to show how sophisticated criminals now are. The piece is quite a long read, and there's two articles that the journalist at the iPaper released. It was a bit of an exclusive from her perspective, but I'd encourage you to have a read of that, because it just shows the level of sophistication, and also really shows that sort of signed ID is no longer really fit for purpose if you look at that journey, which is why the likes of DCMS. So I'm also director of engagement at today's Conveyancer. So you might have seen that yesterday morning we produced an article, and then we are producing a series of articles following a virtual roundtable we held with DCMS, the Land Registry, MHCLG, etc., which focuses on this area. You can see why that's such a key focus over the next probably 2 years or so. But yeah, go and have a read of that one. It's quite interesting.
Tom, we've just had a question. Could you repeat how we can search for that article, please?
Yep. So just Google. It sounds a bit of an ego trip, but it's not, I promise. Easiest way to find that is just Google my name, so Tom Lyes, and iPaper. So that's the newspaper that it appeared in.
Thank you very much. I think this is our last question for today. What's the most popular fraud you have seen?
Okay, most popular fraud at the moment and for some time, if I revert back to, let me just get back to my slides. If we go back here, okay, is in relation to fraudulent email activity, so email modification fraud. So criminals impersonating law firms or impersonating consumers is the most common method of attack at present. And that's why I focused quite heavily on talking about how you communicate to clients about what your bank details are, because that's where at the moment most attacks are happening. So yeah, email modification fraud is the highest area of risk. And ultimately, let's remember that email was never set out to do what it does now. And it's not particularly good in those areas. What would you say is the best website out there to check a client account bank details are legitimate? Well, funnily enough, I would say Lawyer Checker is the best way of doing that, which you can order through InfoTrack. The reason I would say that Lawyer Checker is the best way of checking those details is because we integrate directly with the SRA. So that means we have up-to-date information around scam alerts, interventions, notices, insolvency. We are the only business that runs real-time checks on those data. And we've also completed over 1 million searches, which means we're pretty experienced in what we do. And we used on 1 in 4 residential UK property transactions in England and Wales, and also our further research report provide great clarity where there are potentially red flags, and we can help you make that risk-based decision using that information. The fact that it's also easily available to use via InfoTrack should make it nice and easy for you as well. And I think I mentioned this briefly earlier, but we offer something called a refresh search. So when you order Lawyer Checker through InfoTrack, once you've got your initial result, there's a little button in the top right-hand corner which says Update Search, and that allows you to refresh that search free of charge. So best practice is you order your Lawyer Checker early, and then you refresh it just before you send monies.
Thank you very much, Tom. I'm just looking at the time. I would just like to say a big thank you to you, Tom, for your time today. I hope you all found this session informative. If you do have any other questions about anything you've learned today, you can contact Tom directly. If we haven't been able to answer your question during the webinar, we will answer it offline. If you have any other questions in relation to the Lawyer Checker offering and how it works through the InfoTrack platform, you can also get in touch with your account manager who'll be able to assist you. We've also had a couple of queries about this presentation, so we will be sending this out to you all after this session, so you can refer back to Tom Notes at a later date. All that's left to say is thank you so much for dialing in today, and I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day.
Cool. Thanks for having me, Lucy, and thanks everyone for asking so many questions and for being so engaging. Really appreciate it.